Claude responded. You always think of yourself first, my daughter-in-law said, standing so fast her chair tipped backward. You always think of yourself first, my daughter-in-law said, standing so fast her chair tipped backward. Then her husband, my own son, picked up the glass pitcher of sweet tea and hurled it at my chest. It missed my face by inches, but the ice and glass caught my forearm when I threw it up to block, and a shard opened a gash near my wrist, deep enough that blood immediately started dripping onto my sister's hardwood floor. The whole room went dead silent except for my granddaughter's cartoon still playing in the den. And here's the part nobody at that table understood. I smiled. I stood up, wrapped a cloth napkin around my wrist, walked out to my truck, and drove myself to urgent care, because what none of them knew was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for almost 4 months. My name is Walter Reams. I'm 71 years old. I spent 38 years running a small hardware store in Macon, Georgia, before I sold it and retired. And this is the story of the 4th of July cookout that ended one version of my family and gave me back a version I could actually live with. I live alone in a 4-bedroom house out on Persimmon Road, about 15 minutes outside Macon. The same house my wife Doris and I built in 1987, back when we still thought we'd fill every one of those bedrooms with grandchildren visiting on weekends. Doris passed 6 years ago, congestive heart failure, quiet in her sleep, which I've always been grateful for, even though it still knocked the wind out of me for the better part of a year. Since then, the house has done that thing houses do when someone's been gone a while. It gets bigger, quieter. You stop cooking full meals because there's no one to share them with, and you start noticing how loud your own footsteps sound on the stairs. My son Dale is 37. He married a woman named Crystal about 6 years back, and they've got one daughter, Maddie, who just turned 7. Dale works in equipment sales, does fine, not great, and Crystal's worked on and off at a dental office, depending on childcare. For most of their marriage, things between us were easy enough. Sunday phone calls, birthdays, Dale coming out to help me with the gutters every fall. Nothing special, but nothing wrong either. That started to shift about a year ago, right around the time Crystal's brother, a man named Todd Bishop, lost his job at the poultry plant outside Perry and moved back in with Crystal's parents because he couldn't make rent on his own place anymore. I didn't think much of it at first. Family helps family. That's just how it's supposed to work. And I felt for the man, genuinely. But Crystal's parents' place was small, a 2-bedroom, and Todd had a girlfriend, a woman named Renee, who had her own 2 kids from a previous relationship. And pretty soon, that 2-bedroom house had 6 people in it. I heard about it the way you hear about most things in a family, secondhand, at holidays, in passing comments that don't mean much until you look back and realize they'd been building towards something the whole time. About 3 months before the 4th of July, I sat down with a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Voss, who'd handled Doris's estate paperwork and had stayed on as mine after that. I told her what I was noticing, the offhand comments from Dale about how big my house was for just one person, the way Crystal had started asking pointed questions about whether I still used all 4 bedrooms or just the one. Patricia didn't tell me I was overreacting. She told me family pressure without any legal weight behind it isn't something a court can touch, but she said the moment anything crossed from words into action, I needed to document it immediately, medically if necessary, and call her before I called anyone else. We joked, a little grimly, calling it my insurance policy. I laughed when she said it. I did not think I'd need it as soon as I did. 2 weeks before the 4th of July, Dale called me on a Thursday night while I was out on the back porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the fireflies start up over the tree line. He had that particular tone in his voice, a little too easy, a little too rehearsed, the same tone he used to use in high school right before asking to borrow the truck for something he knew I'd say no to if he asked straight out. Dad, he said, we were thinking, since it's the 4th and everybody's off, maybe we could all get together at Aunt Carol's place, make it a real family thing this year. Todd and Renee and her kids too, so everybody's included. I told him that sounded fine, and it did sound fine, on the surface. My sister Carol has a big backyard out past Bonaire, with plenty of room for a cookout, and there was no good reason for me to say no to a bigger gathering. What I didn't know yet was that Dale and Crystal had already talked through exactly how they wanted to bring up my house that day, and that a big, loud, distracted family cookout was supposed to make it easier for them to catch me off guard. I spent the week before the 4th doing what I always do before a family gathering, which is more than necessary. I picked up 3 bags of ice, a case of soda for the kids, ribs and chicken for the grill, And I dug out Doris's old cast iron pot to make the baked beans the way she used to, low and slow with brown sugar and bacon, because some habits don't go away just because the person who taught them to you did. I wanted that day to feel normal, warm, the way the fourth used to feel when Doris was still around and the yard was loud with kids running through the sprinkler until it got dark enough for sparklers. I had no idea that by the time the fireworks were supposed to start that night, I'd be sitting in an urgent care waiting room with a bandage on my arm instead. The fourth came in hot, the kind of thick Georgia heat that makes the air feel like a wet towel by 10 in the morning. Carol's place was already going by the time I got there. Around 1, string lights up between the trees, a folding table loaded with sides, and my brother-in-law Ray manning the grill like he does every year. Dale and Crystal showed up not long after with Maddie, and Todd and Renee pulled in about 20 minutes later with Renee's 2 kids in tow, all of them piling out of a car that had definitely seen better days. The kids took off toward the little above-ground pool Carol keeps set up every summer, and for a while, it really did feel like a normal fourth. Todd talked baseball with Ray by the grill. Renee complimented my beans, asked what my secret was, and I told her bacon fat, which is always the answer. And I remember thinking, this isn't so bad. Maybe I'd been reading too much into things. We sat down to eat around 3, plates balanced on knees and laps since Carol's table only seats 8, and there were 12 of us counting the kids. About halfway through the meal, Crystal set her plate down on the arm of her lawn chair and looked around Carol's backyard, slow, the same unhurried way she'd been looking at things at my place the last few times she'd visited. You know, she said, loud enough for the table to hear, Walter's got that whole house out on Persimmon Road, 4 bedrooms, and it's just him rattling around in it. I said something simple back, agreed it was a lot of space for one person, didn't think much of the comment yet. Dale glanced over at Crystal, a quick look I caught but didn't understand at the time, and Todd suddenly got very interested in his plate of ribs, which felt like a deliberate way of not being part of whatever was coming next. I didn't know it then, but that was the calm before the part of the day I would not forget. Dessert hadn't even come out yet when Crystal set her cup down harder than she needed to and said what she'd clearly been working up to since we sat down. Walter, she said, Todd and Renee and her boys have been squeezed into Mom and Dad's tiny house for months now, and you've got 3 empty bedrooms just sitting there. I think it makes sense for them to move out to your place for a while, just until Todd gets back on his feet. The table went quiet, except for the kids splashing in the pool out back. I set my fork down slow and told her I understood Todd was having a hard time. And I meant that, but my house was my home, not a solution for someone else's living situation. And I wasn't comfortable turning it into a permanent arrangement for a man I barely knew and a woman I'd met maybe 3 times in my life. Crystal's face changed fast, the pleasant mask from earlier sliding right off. It's not permanent, she said, her voice climbing. It's just until he's back on his feet, and those rooms just sit there doing nothing while my brother's family is stacked on top of each other like sardines. Dale jumped in then, trying to sound reasonable, but landing a lot closer to pleading. Dad, come on, it's not that big of an ask. They're family too now. I looked at my son, at the boy I taught to fish and change a tire and shake a man's hand like he meant it, and I told him as calm as I could that it was still my decision about my own home, and the answer right now was no. Todd and Renee sat there looking embarrassed, Renee's eyes down at her plate, Todd shifting like he wanted to sink straight through his lawn chair. I don't think either of them had asked for this fight to happen in front of the whole family, and looking back, I still believe that. But Crystal wasn't finished, and neither was Dale, and the temperature in that backyard was about to climb a lot faster than I expected. Dale stood up so fast, his lawn chair folded flat behind him. He pointed a finger at me the way I used to point a finger at him when he came home past curfew smelling like somebody else's cigarettes. You always think of yourself first, he said, loud enough that Ray turned around from the grill. This whole big house just for you, and you can't help out family that actually needs it. I told him to lower his voice, that there were kids around, but he kept going, telling me I'd always been this way, always putting my own comfort ahead of everybody else's needs. Crystal chimed in right behind him, her voice rising to match his. 3 empty bedrooms, Walter, she said, nearly shouting it now. Just sitting there doing nothing while my brother's family suffers, and you won't even think about it for 1 second. I stayed in my seat. I stayed calm, because 38 years of talking down angry customers and angrier vendors had taught me that matching somebody's volume never once solved anything. I told them both evenly that this conversation was finished, that my house wasn't up for a vote at somebody else's cookout, and that if Todd and Renee needed help, we could talk about other kinds of help that didn't involve moving into my home. That's when Dale reached over, grabbed the glass pitcher of sweet tea off the table, and threw it straight at me. I got my arm up in time to keep it off my face, but the pitcher shattered against my forearm, ice and glass and tea going everywhere, and one piece of glass caught me deep enough on the inside of my wrist that I felt the sting a half second before I saw the blood start running down over my fingers and dripping onto Carol's back porch boards. The whole yard went silent, except for Maddie's voice from the pool, asking what happened. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Dale stood there with his arms still half extended, mouth open like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. Crystal's hand had flown up to cover her own mouth. Todd and Renee both stood up fast, Renee already reaching for a dish towel off the table even though nobody had asked her to. Ray had turned all the way around from the grill, tongs still in hand, face gone pale. I looked down at my wrist, at the blood running steady between my fingers, and then I did something that confused every single person in that yard. I smiled. Not a big smile, just small and calm. Because in that exact second, standing there bleeding in my sister's backyard on the 4th of July, I understood with total clarity that everything I'd quietly put in place over the last 3 months had just become necessary, and I no longer had to wonder if I'd been overreacting to anything. "Dad," Dale said, his voice cracking. "Are you okay?" I didn't mean, and I held up my other hand to stop him without saying a word. I walked over to Carol's outdoor sink, ran cold water over the cut for a few seconds, then grabbed a clean dish towel and wrapped it tight around my wrist. "Where are you going?" Dale called after me, somewhere between panic and confusion, as I headed for my truck. I told him I was going to get it looked at, and that he should stay and take care of his family and his guests. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anybody of anything out loud. I just walked to my truck with the towel already going red, got in, and pulled out of Carol's driveway while my son stood there in the yard, still not understanding what he'd just started. The drive to the urgent care off Bass Road took about 14 minutes, and I remember every one of them clear as day. I kept the towel pressed tight with one hand and drove with the other, steadier than I probably had any right to be given the circumstances. At the light on Riverside, I reached into my shirt pocket with my free hand and pulled out my phone, and I typed out a short message to Patricia Voss, the lawyer who'd been getting ready for this moment right alongside me without either of us knowing exactly when it would land. The message said only 4 words. Step 1 is done. I want to explain what that meant, because it wasn't some dramatic thing out of a movie. It was simple, and it was practical. 3 months earlier, after I started noticing the pattern of comments about my house, I'd gone to Patricia and asked her flat out what my options were if things ever went further than uncomfortable conversation. She told me guilt and pressure, ugly as they are, don't carry any weight in front of a judge. But if something ever turned physical, even something that started as an object thrown across a table, that became a different matter entirely, one with real legal teeth behind it. We agreed that if that day ever came, my very first move, before calling her, before calling anybody, was to get seen by a medical professional and get the injury documented properly. Because a record made in the moment carries an honesty that memories and arguments after the fact just can't match. Step 1 was never about getting even. It was about making sure that if my family ever crossed a line they couldn't walk back, there'd be an honest account of exactly what happened, starting from the second it happened. I walked into urgent care with a soaked dish towel around my wrist, and a nurse named Angela took one look and had me back in a room within 5 minutes. The doctor on call, a younger man named Dr. Osei, examined the cut and told me it was deep enough to need 8 stitches, and that I was lucky it hadn't caught anything closer to a tendon. While he cleaned it, he asked me routine questions, how it happened, whether I felt safe at home, and I answered him straight, telling him my son had thrown a glass pitcher at me during an argument at a family cookout. His expression didn't change much, but I could tell he'd heard enough stories like mine to know what came next. He explained, gentle but clear, that his office was required to notify law enforcement anytime a patient came in hurt by another person, especially in something that looked like a family dispute, and that an officer would probably want to talk to me before I left. I told him that was fine, that I understood, and if I'm honest, some part of me had already expected exactly that. About 25 minutes after Dr. Osei finished stitching me up, a Bibb County Sheriff's deputy walked into my little curtained area, notepad already out. His name was Deputy Coleman, A heavy-set man in his 40s, with an unhurried way of asking questions that told me right away this wasn't his first time taking a report like mine. He had me walk him through the whole day, start to finish. And I did, keeping my voice level, sticking to what actually happened, not stretching anything and not leaving anything out either. I told him about the ask to move Todd and Renee into my house, my refusal, Dale and Crystal raising their voices, and Dale grabbing that picture and throwing it straight at me in front of the entire family, including Todd and Renee and my own granddaughter, not 30 feet away in the pool. Deputy Coleman wrote it all down, asking every so often where exactly I'd been sitting, how far Dale had been standing, whether the throw looked deliberate or more like something that got knocked over in the heat of an argument. I told him honestly, it looked deliberate to me, that Dale picked that pitcher up with purpose and threw it. Didn't knock it over, reaching for something else. He nodded, told me this would go down as a report of aggravated battery given the injury, and that he'd be following up with Dale directly to get his side of it too. While he finished writing, my phone kept buzzing over and over in my shirt pocket, Dale's name lighting up the screen every single time. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't have the words yet, and I didn't want to say something I couldn't take back while everything was still so raw. Deputy Coleman handed me his card before he left, told me to call if I remembered anything else, and said somebody would follow up soon on next steps. That same evening, while I sat at home with 8 stitches and a wrapped forearm, Deputy Coleman and another officer drove out to Dale and Crystal's place to get his side of the story. Standard procedure whenever a report like mine gets filed. I heard how that conversation went a couple days later, part from Dale, part from Patricia, who had her own way of checking on where things stood. From what I was told, Dale tried to explain it as him just gesturing with his hands during a heated moment, and the pitcher slipping out of his grip by accident. The trouble for him was that didn't match what 4 other adults at that cookout had already told the deputy earlier that same day, since Coleman had gotten short statements from Ray, Carol, Todd, and even Crystal before I ever left for urgent care. All of them, Crystal included, confirmed Dale had picked that pitcher up and thrown it, not dropped it or bumped it by mistake. Deputy Coleman told Dale plainly that the injury, the witness statements, and the distance that pitcher traveled across the table didn't line up with an accident, and that the case would move forward with the district attorney's office deciding how to proceed. I'm told Dale went quiet after that, sitting on his own back steps for a long while before he'd even go back inside to face Crystal. Over the following days, my phone rang constantly, Dale mostly, Crystal every so often, the voicemails swinging between apology and something closer to defensiveness, depending on the hour and who was calling. I let most of it go to voicemail while I focused on healing up and meeting with Patricia to work out what came next, because step 1 had only ever been the beginning, not the whole plan. Sitting in Patricia's office about a week after the 4th, we went through my options carefully. I told her I had no interest in dragging things out for years or trying to punish my own son beyond whatever the courts decided was fair for what actually happened. But I also told her I was done being treated like a housing solution by people who were supposed to love me. Patricia suggested we handle 2 things at once. First, a temporary protective order, giving both Dale's household and me some legally backed distance, while the aggravated battery charge worked through the system. Second, and this mattered more to me personally, restructuring my will so that my house and my savings would go directly into a trust for Maddie's future, education, and beyond, administered by Patricia herself rather than by Dale or Crystal, with me keeping full use and control of everything while I was still alive to use it. This wasn't about cutting my son out or punishing my granddaughter. It was about making sure nobody could ever again treat my home or my finances as something to be argued over at a family cookout, using guilt instead of respect. Patricia filed the paperwork within the week, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was steering my own life again, instead of just reacting to whatever came at me next. About 3 weeks after the 4th, against Patricia's advice, and honestly against my own better judgment too, I let Dale and Crystal come out to the house to talk face to face. My stitches had come out by then, leaving a thin, pale line on the inside of my wrist that Dr. Osei said would fade some, but probably never disappear all the way. Crystal looked like she hadn't slept right in weeks, and Dale looked worse. The 2 of them sat stiff on my porch swing while I sat across from them in the old rocker Doris used to read in every evening. Dale apologized first, his voice unsteady, saying he never meant for it to go that far, that he'd just been caught up trying to help Crystal's family, and it all came out sideways at the worst possible second. I told him I believed he was sorry, but sorry didn't erase what happened, and throwing something at your own father, hard enough to put him in a doctor's chair for stitches, was never an acceptable way to handle being told no. Crystal tried to jump in, asking if there was any way I could talk to the district attorney and make things easier on Dale, and I told her plainly that this wasn't mine to control anymore, that the state was handling it now, and Dale would face whatever the process decided was fair, same as anybody else would. I also told them both about the trust I'd set up for Maddie, explaining calm as I could that it wasn't punishment, it was me making sure my home and my money were protected for my granddaughter's future instead of sitting there as something to fight over at family gatherings. Dale went quiet for a long stretch, staring at the porch boards, and I could see something shifting behind his eyes. Somewhere between shame and finally understanding what his own family had lost sight of over the last several months. Dale's court date came about 11 weeks later, and since it was his first offense with no record behind it, the district attorney's office offered him a plea deal instead of taking it to trial. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of misdemeanor battery, and the judge handed down 80 hours of community service, a fine, and 6 months of court-ordered anger management, along with the protective order Patricia had put in place, staying active the same length of time. It wasn't dramatic, nothing like what you'd see on television, just a quiet, practical outcome that matched what had actually happened, and one I honestly felt was fair given the circumstances. I didn't go to the hearing myself, spent that morning out working in the yard instead, since Patricia told me my written statement to the court had already said everything that needed saying. Word got around out past Bonaire the way it always does in a small enough town, and I was surprised how many folks reached out over the following weeks. My neighbor Frank came by one evening with a plate of his wife's cornbread just to check on me. An old customer from the hardware store called after hearing a version of it secondhand, just to make sure I was doing all right. Nobody made me feel foolish for calling it in, and nobody suggested I'd overreacted by letting the law get involved, which meant more to me than I expected it would. Todd and Renee, through a housing assistance program Patricia actually helped connect them with, found a small two-bedroom place of their own near Perry a few months later, something that fit their actual budget without needing anybody else's spare rooms to make it work. Turned out there'd been a real solution to their situation the whole time, one that never needed my house or a sweet tea pitcher to get there. By late that fall, things between Dale and me had started, slow and careful, to find some kind of new normal. He reached out on his own, without Crystal, more than once, asking if we could grab lunch, just the two of us. During those lunches, he apologized again, this time without asking me to make anything go away or pretend it hadn't happened the way it did. He admitted he'd let Crystal's worry over her brother pull him into pushing me in a way he wasn't proud of, and that watching me bleed on Carol's back porch had been the moment the whole thing finally looked as ugly to him as it actually was. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I still loved him. But trust between us would need rebuilding slow, the same way any broken trust does, through what you do over time, not through one conversation on a porch swing. Crystal and I spoke exactly once, right after the court proceedings wrapped up. A short, careful talk where she thanked me, a little awkward about it, for not pushing the DA towards something harsher than what Dale got. I told her honestly I hoped the counseling helped both of them, and that maybe someday we could all sit at a table together again without anybody flinching. But that timeline wasn't only up to me anymore, and some doors take longer to open than others, especially the ones slammed shut that hard. I started seeing Maddie again on a regular Saturday schedule, usually with just Dale bringing her out, and, slow but sure, the bedrooms upstairs filled back up on weekends with the sound of a 7-year-old building blanket forts and asking me to tell her stories about her grandmother. It's been almost a year now since that 4th of July, and my life looks different than it did back then, quieter in some corners, fuller in others. The thin scar on my wrist barely shows anymore unless you know right where to look, though I notice Dale's eyes drift there sometimes when we're talking, like he's remembering something he'd rather not. The trust Patricia set up for Maddie is still in place, still fully under my control while I'm around to use it, and I've made my peace with the fact that protecting it wasn't cold or selfish. It was just responsible, the kind of thing Doris would have wanted done for our granddaughter, no guilt attached to it at all. I put in a bigger garden out back that spring, tomatoes and okra mostly, the way Doris used to grow every summer. And some Saturdays, Maddie helps me pick what's ready while Dale mows what's left of the yard the way he did as a teenager, except now he does it without me having to ask twice. I never went looking to get even that 4th of July. Not really. Not the way people usually mean when they say that. All I ever wanted was for my own home, my own safety, and my own choices to finally be respected by the people who were supposed to respect them more than anybody else. And sometimes, Protecting yourself calm, honest, and legal is the only kind of getting even that actually holds up over time. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with my story from start to finish. And if any part of it landed with you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Hit that like button and subscribe for more, because I promise you, there's more where this came from. Claude responded, "Love doesn't mean saying yes to everything, and boundaries aren't the opposite of family. They're what keeps it standing." Love doesn't mean saying yes to everything, and boundaries aren't the opposite of family. They're what keeps it standing. A quiet home, respected and protected, can hold more warmth than one thrown wide open out of guilt. Sometimes the kindest thing you do for the people you love is refuse to let anyone, even them, turn your peace into something up for grabs. A small note for you: this story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope the life lesson woven into it still lands somewhere real and positive in your heart.